Hi everyone, and welcome back to Lies, the part of Extra History where I talk all about the mistakes we made and tangent all over the place to tell you the stories that got left on the cutting room floor as we were putting these episodes together. The credits flags were a plague again. There were just a ton we got wrong, like using the Austria-Hungary flag instead of the Austrian flag. We also sort of missed by a mile on some of the maps. The borders on Luxembourg, Poland, Belgium, basically everything were wrong at some point. And we had the magic aim-changing Moltke in the episodes. The correct representation is the one in episode 6. The other one you might recognize from World War I. None of this stuff materially affects the story, but I'm sorry we missed it in so many places. And Kant. It's pronounced Kant. Anyway, on to things a bit more substantive. What we've told is really only half the story of Bismarck. Like with Justinian, Bismarck just did too much stuff to fit in a single series. It's my hope that sooner or later the patrons vote for us to cover the second half of Bismarck's life, so we can see how his plans turned out. Because the second half of his life is so important to contextualize him. There's a lot of ways to look at Bismarck, and while we tried to paint him as arrogant and a wastrel, but also a lovable rogue in his own way, personally I think that's fair. But there are certain other ways to look at him, and character flaws will come up in that second half that we really should address in case it's quite some time we get there, because this wasn't the full story of Bismarck. The biggest black mark on Bismarck's career to me is that he was pretty clearly an anti-Polish racist. Poland will end up causing him so many problems that he developed a deep loathing for basically anything Polish. He's also been accused of being an anti-Semite. I don't actually really see this. There are plenty of places where he literally said quotes like, I decidedly disapprove of the agitation against the Jews, be it on religious or racial grounds. And he refused to make constitutional amendments against them. But that said, he was too complacent about anti-Semites. If we do a follow-up series, you'll see that there's this point at which he gets frustrated with the liberal industrialists who he's been working with for basically most of his chancellorship. And so instead he forms a coalition with religious conservatives. And these particular religious conservatives are radical anti-Semites. He curbs some of their most sort of extreme desires, but he still lets the rhetoric go unchecked. And I think he saw it as a political expedient. Basically, let them rant while he uses them to get his political agenda through. I see this much akin to what happened to conservatism in the United States. I don't think that the majority of conservatives in the United States, including most of the conservative politicians out there, are actually conscious racists or extreme Islamophobes. But the Conservative Party aligned itself with extremists and brought their rhetoric into its platform to use them as a base to get their agenda through. And like conservatives here in the United States, I think Bismarck thought a lot of the religious extremists he was working with were ridiculous, and that all their sound and fury would burn itself out while the policies he used them to help enact would last for a great long time. I think he thought the populace would see through all the silly shouting and the impossibly overstated claims, and that the movement he sort of made a devil's bargain with would end up as a historical footnote. I think this idea that Germany would end up with concentration camps and a Holocaust 50 years down the line was as remote and insane sounding to him as it would be for America to Americans today. I think he says to himself, we work with these guys and maybe we move the needle from 0% to 5% the country develops into a horrible racist nightmare. I mean, really, it would take something truly ludicrous like losing most costly and devastating war in human history up to that point, and then following that up with an economic collapse so vast that people were taking wheelbarrows of money to go buy bread in order for anyone to take these guys seriously. But, stuff happens. And it's absolutely Bismarck's fault for opening that door by working with these guys rather than just nipping it in the bud. There's also the question of whether World War I was his fault. I'm not sure that's the right question, because sure, if you say that the creation of Germany caused World War I, and Bismarck was responsible for the creation of Germany, then yeah, it's clearly his fault. But I think a more interesting question is, why didn't World War I happen sooner? I take the creation of Germany as inevitable. If you disagree with this premise, then it's totally reasonable to pin World War I on Bismarck, but I can't see it any other way. Too much of the 19th century is sort of colluding to make it seem impossible that Germany doesn't become one nation. So if you accept that Germany was just gonna be a thing, you have to ask why plopping down a power in the middle of Europe that was potentially both economically and militarily more powerful than any of the other powers at the time didn't cause a wide-scale conflict earlier. And to me, sort of the answer is actually Bismarck. I think Bismarck's main goal throughout his entire life is actually creating a diplomatic situation in which Germany wouldn't be attacked before it was too strong for anyone to think about attacking it. And, I mean, he almost succeeded. If he hadn't been booted and his diplomatic efforts not just ignored, but completely reversed, you might not have had World War I. But one of his main failings is that he literally couldn't see a world without Bismarck. The one thing he didn't have a plan for was what was going to happen when other people took over and decided to do things radically different, even completely opposed to Bismarck's great plan. Of course, you can argue that if Bismarck hadn't come along, Germany might have been unified under some other German faction, maybe Austria, and rather than Prussia, which might have led to a less militaristic society, which in turn might have radically altered the course of history. I think this is totally valid, and I think there's a lot of interesting things to explore there. Also, as far as his character goes, he was an aristocratic autocrat. He believed in a certain social order and believed that society worked better than he was running things, rather than actually letting them be run democratically. And sometimes, I mean, this can be true in the short term when a great leader is in charge. Democracy is not about consistently getting the very best person to run things in the most efficient way possible. Rather, when it's working properly, democracy is about getting reasonable people to run things reasonably and giving the people tools to remove those people if they're not doing so. Which means that in the short term, some autocratic system might actually be more efficient. With a benign ruler, it might even be just better. But in the long term, that sort of autocracy always is worse. Democracy is a long-term system. Even if you ignore the benefits of getting everyone involved in civil life, even if you ignore the moral value of giving each person some agency over their own destiny, true democracy avoids disastrous rulers that autocracy always eventually leads to, and so is plain more efficient in the end. But Bismarck is an autocrat, and he builds this autocratic style of leadership into the fledgling German nation. And that's something that you can certainly blame him for down the road. It's gonna cause problems. But on the other hand, for all that, I do think he represents a lot of how conservatism is supposed to work. He had a power structure and an order he wanted to preserve, or conserve even. And he felt that it was better for the nation and that it would be better just served by it. But of course, it also involved him and his buddies ruling, but he realized that in order to conserve the existing power structure, he had to make the average person's life good enough that they had no reason to complain about the guys just staying in power and them continuing to run things sort of the old way. He made everyone's life pleasant enough that there was no call for radical new ideas or a change in political direction. He made sure he did this. And I'm sure this will all come up in a follow-up Bismarck, but I want to make sure we say it here in case we don't get there for a while, because he created a social security system, nearly universal mandatory health care, sick days, wide-scale accident insurance for workers. And why? Because he wanted the people to love the state as he designed it, the state as he maintained it. this conservative state he thought of. He wanted them to love their benevolent monarch and not cry out for change. One of the most effective things he ever did to combat socialism was to implement policies that made people's life good enough that they wouldn't be tempted by the promises of socialism, which ran counter to the old way he strove for as a conservative. Which leads me to a story, because the best part of this, do you know what he named his welfare legislation? It's genius. He literally named it Practical Christianity. That was the name of the bill. And it's pretty hard for his ultra-conservative religious allies to agitate against practical Christianity. But all right, I've officially rambled on forever. Let me see if there's any other lies really that I need to cover. In episode 2, when I talked about him grabbing a bunch of peasants to go down and put down an uprising that was empowering the peasantry, I probably should have mentioned it wasn't really just about empowering the peasantry. It was at least as much about expanding the rights of industrial workers and the middle class, but you know. And in episode 3, I skipped a whole part in Bismarck's life where he's assigned to minor random posts in Europe and doesn't really do a lot. It doesn't affect the history, but I figure I should bring it up here because I feel like it's that period that gives him a sense of the European political landscape and gets him thinking about Germany's place in Europe as a whole. Oh, and there's also a small pile of procedural parliamentary stuff that I skipped over about how he ended up getting to use the budget over and over and over again when the Landtag wouldn't approve his budget. So if you're a policy wonk and like really into parliamentary procedure, you might want to look into that section because there's some amusing stuff going on. Oh, and in episode 4, and really throughout the rest of the series, I had to cut a character named Albrecht von Roon. He was the war minister. He was actually a huge help to Bismarck and a very influential part of Bismarck's government. Not to mention being an interesting character in his own right, and saving Bismarck's bacon a bunch. He's, though, probably the biggest omission in this whole thing, so if you dig Bismarck, you might get a kick out of just looking up von Roon. And he had the rad nickname, the Great Silent One. And in episode 5, remember when I'm talking about Bismarck doing some crafty letter editing to get France and Prussia to go to war? Well, that's another thing you should definitely look up because it's immensely amusing. But I think my favorite bit was the word choice. I don't know if Bismarck knew this or not, but I suspect he did. When he was making his selective cuts to the king's letter, he chose to keep the word king's adjunct. He chose to say that the king's adjunct had been sent to dismiss the French ambassador, which was fine and appropriate to the ambassador's rank. But the French had no similar position to king's adjunct, and the only adjunct in French is a non-commissioned officer. So, of course, all of the French papers published that the Prussian king had sent an NCO to dismiss their ambassador, which was a grave insult, while the Prussian papers all published the king's adjunct had sent, showing the king acting magnanimously and observing protocol even though he had been slighted. So it was amazing, just using the same word, not saying anything different to the two sides. He got them to see the issue radically differently, both of them in the way he wanted to. And in episode 6, I have a sad fact for you. When they were starving out Paris, the Parisian ate everything, including the city's 2 elephants, Castor and Pollux. And weirdly, Kaiser Wilhelm's first real international appearance was arbitrating a dispute between the US and the UK over the bloodless Pig War in the San Juan Islands, which resulted in the San Juan Islands being given to the United States, which, weirdly and serendipitously enough, is where I wrote a bunch of these episodes. But okay, I think that's about it for lies. There's just one thing left. On September 23rd, 1735, Walpole became the first British Prime Minister to serve from 10 Downing Street. And 127 years later, to the day, Bismarck became the first Prime Minister of Prussia. And 37 years to the day again after that, Nintendo was founded. Coincidence? Yes. Also, lies addendum to lies, Walpole might have actually moved into 10 Downing Street on the 22nd. The 23rd might have actually been his first day serving there as Prime Minister. It was a little bit unclear in the stuff I was reading. Also, about half the books I read on Bismarck had some comparison between him and Walpole. And there was one I found that I didn't really end up using, but it just had this quote that stuck in my mind forever as the best summary. It said, "While corruption was the instrument employed by Walpole, Bismarck merely resorted to coercion." Yep, that's it to a T. But yeah, that's it for me too. If you like the ending theme, go listen to the Kinders' awesome music. It should be posted by the time this goes live. Also, we have a cool Always Have a Plan shirt designed by Lili Scaldafari in the shop. So if you enjoyed that, there's that too. And with that, I leave you. Join us, though, next week as we start to explore the life of the great antagonist of Justinian, Khusro I. See y'all then. Take care, everyone.